The chamber was laughing at us again. I could feel it before I heard it. A low, rippling sound that moved through the tiers of the Galactic Council Hall like a wave finding its shore. It was not the sharp laughter of surprise. It was the slow, comfortable laughter of people who had already decided what they thought of you, and were simply enjoying another moment that confirmed it. I was sitting 3 rows behind Ambassador Lena Hargrove, close enough to see the exact moment her pen stopped moving across her notepad. She had been writing notes throughout the session. She stopped when the Kethoran delegate, a tall, gray-scaled being named Vorath, spread his 4-fingered hands wide and said, in the common galactic tongue that every species had agreed to use, that humanity's latest proposal for shared early warning sensor arrays along the galactic rim was, and I will quote him exactly because I have never forgotten it, the anxious suggestion of a species that has not yet learned the difference between caution and fear. The chamber laughed. Vorath let it run. He was a skilled speaker, and skilled speakers know when to stay quiet and let the room do their work for them. My name is Murren Voss. At the time, I was 29 years old, and I had been working as a senior aide to the human delegation for 4 years. I had sat in that chamber dozens of times. I had watched our proposals get redirected, reworded, tabled, or simply ignored. I had watched our scientists present data that other species delegates quietly photographed and later republished under their own names. I had watched our ambassador smile through insults that were dressed up as procedural comments. I had done all of this, and told myself it was the cost of being part of something larger than any one species, that diplomacy required patience, that our time would come. Sitting in that chamber, listening to the laughter, I stopped believing that. Lena Hargrove set her pen down on the notepad. She did not cap it. She simply set it down, pushed back her chair, and stood up. She did not raise her hand to request speaking time. She did not clear her throat. She walked to the edge of the human delegation's enclosed platform, reached into the front pocket of her jacket, and placed her credentials badge on the flat edge of the podium railing. It made a very small sound when it landed, a small, clean click. Then she walked away. I was already on my feet. I do not fully remember deciding to stand. I remember my chair scraping back, and I remember following her, and I remember the laughter in the room changing texture, becoming uncertain, confused, a little uneasy. I did not look at Vorath. I did not look at the other delegates. I kept my eyes on the back of Lena's jacket as we walked through the human delegation's exit corridor, and then through the secondary access hall, and then out into the wide, pale corridor that connected the council's central chamber to the embassy wings. She did not stop walking until we reached the outer terrace that overlooked the station's observation bay. Through the floor-to-ceiling panels, the stars were steady and cold, and entirely indifferent to what had just happened inside. She stood there for a long moment. I stood beside her. "Are we done?" I asked. "We are done," she said. Her voice was completely calm, not the calm of someone who had suppressed something, the calm of someone who had made a decision so completely that the making of it was already in the past. I had worked with Lena Hargrove for 4 years, and I had never once seen her flustered. What I saw on her face that evening was not anger, not relief, not grief. It was something quieter, and in some ways more final than any of those. It was clarity. Within 6 hours, the recall order had gone out to every human national, aide, contractor, and technician stationed anywhere in council-administered space. It did not come from her. It came from the Secretary General's office back on Earth, which meant the decision had not been made in that chamber. It had been made before. The badge on the podium had not been a protest. It had been a signal. I spent the next 18 hours helping coordinate the departure. There were over 4,000 humans scattered across the station and the surrounding council habitats. Embassy workers, engineers who maintained the common environmental systems in 2 of the station's residential rings, medical staff at the shared clinic, translators, logistics officers, data technicians. We did not announce our departure. We did not file notices or hold press events. We packed what was ours. We shut down our terminals cleanly. We handed over nothing that was not already in the shared systems, and we locked everything that was specifically ours. I passed Vorath in the corridor outside the council's administrative wing late that night. He was walking with 2 of his aides and speaking in Kethoran without bothering to shift to the common tongue, which was something their delegation always did when they did not want to be understood. He looked at me as we passed. He did not say anything. I did not say anything. I kept walking. The transport that carried the last of the human delegation departed from docking ring 4, At 0340 station time, I was on it. I had one bag. I sat by the window and watched the station fall behind us, its lights arranged in the long, curved pattern that the Prethian architects had designed 300 years ago, and that the council used on all its promotional materials because it was genuinely beautiful. I watched it until it was small enough to cover with my thumb. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel sad. I felt, very strangely, as though I had been holding my breath for 4 years and had only just now exhaled. Back in council space, the silence where our people had been was already beginning to be felt. Not loudly, not yet. Quietly, the way you feel the absence of something only after you reach for it and find it gone. The Emergency Environmental Control Panel in Residential Ring 2 had a recurring calibration fault that the human technician on rotation had been correcting manually every 72 hours. No one else knew the correction protocol. The fault would reassert itself in 3 days, and the ring's atmospheric regulators would begin to drift. The shared medical clinic's translation interface ran on a middleware system our team had written and maintained. Without the maintenance key, it would begin producing errors in non-human diagnostic inputs within a week. The early warning sensor nodes we had installed along the outer rim, the ones Vorath had laughed at, ran on a distributed processing architecture that required periodic human-administered synchronization. Without it, the nodes would begin to fall out of alignment with each other. They would still detect things. They would just stop being able to confirm what they detected was real versus signal noise. I did not know all of this at the time. I learned it later, from reports, from intercepted council communications, from the very slow and very satisfying process of watching a galaxy discover that it had confused tolerance for dependence, and had only worked out the difference after the thing it depended on had quietly walked out the door. None of us said goodbye. There was no speech, no statement, no open letter to the galactic community. The comms channels from our embassies simply went dark. The lights in our offices switched off. The desks were clean. The terminals were locked. We were just gone. And the council, for exactly 1 week, continued to find that funny. 31 months after the last human transport left council space, I was stationed at Relay Hub Callisto 7. It was not a glamorous posting. Callisto 7 was a mid-sized deep space installation, anchored to a slow orbit around a brown dwarf, that no one had ever thought worth naming. It had been built in 14 months using prefabricated modules and a construction crew that worked in shifts around the clock without complaint, because that was what the job required and everyone on that crew understood the job. It had no scenic observation decks. Its corridors were functional and plain. Its cafeteria served 3 rotating menus and the coffee was genuinely good, which mattered more than people admitted. It had a signals intelligence section, a fleet coordination hub, an engineering bay, and a medical unit staffed by 4 people who could collectively handle almost anything short of major surgery. I ran the signals section with a team of 9. Our official function was to maintain contact with the network of human relay stations being built across the outer systems. Our unofficial function, which was also our official function, just not the one written on the station's operational charter, was to listen. We listened to everything. The council's communication protocols were not encrypted in any serious way. They had never needed to be. No one had ever had both the motivation and the technical capability to intercept their traffic. Or at least, that had been the assumption. We had been listening since before we left. I had been listening for 11 months by the time the first wave of what I can only describe as panic began to show up in their administrative channels. It started small. A maintenance request flagged as unresolvable in Residential Ring 2 of the main council station. A formal inquiry from the medical clinic to the council's internal logistics office, asking where the replacement software keys for the translation interface were stored, because no one seemed to know. A supply chain notification from the council's materials bureau, noting that orders for a specific type of drive component, used in the most common class of council mid-range transport vessel, had gone unfulfilled for 6 consecutive delivery cycles, because the only certified manufacturers of that component had been human firms, and no alternative source had been identified. Owen Marsh, my second-in-command, brought me that last one with his morning report. He set it on my desk without saying anything, which was how he communicated things he found interesting. Owen communicated almost entirely through what he chose not to say. "How long do their existing stock last them?" I asked. "Based on their fleet size and average usage rate," he said. 18 months. After that, they start decommissioning ships. I read the rest of the report. The Council had issued an internal resolution to identify alternative manufacturers within 90 days. The resolution used confident language. Resolutions always used confident language. "What's the timeline on finding an alternative source?" I asked. Owen looked at the ceiling for a moment, which was his version of a pause. "The material tolerances on that component are very specific. The manufacturing process requires a particular polymer extrusion technique that took our people about 8 years to get right. If they're starting from zero, I'd say 4 years minimum. Maybe 5. I set the report down. "Note it." "Already noted," he said. He picked up his coffee and went back to his desk. That was how it was, in those early months. Not dramatic, not loud. Just a steady accumulation of small absences that were becoming large problems, noted and filed and added to the growing record of what the galaxy looked like when humans stopped being part of it. What changed the tone was the Void Swarm. We had known about them for years. Our scientists had first detected their movement patterns 7 years before we left the Council, and it was one of the reasons Lena Hargrove had pushed so hard for the shared rim sensor network. The Void Swarm did not move like a fleet. They moved like weather. Broad, distributed, adaptive, consuming everything in their path, and processing it into more of themselves. They were not intelligent in any way we recognized. They were extraordinarily effective. The Council had been told, multiple times, with data, with projected movement timelines, with specific recommendations for defensive positioning and early warning infrastructure. Vorath had called it the anxious suggestion of a species that has not yet learned the difference between caution and fear. And the chamber had laughed. And now, 31 months later, the Void Swarm's leading edge had been detected at Arethys Station, a Council frontier post 12 light-years from the nearest inhabited system. Arethys Station reported the contact and then went silent. The silence lasted 4 days. Then the Council's emergency frequency lit up with a transmission from a rescue vessel that had gone to investigate. I will not describe what they found. The transmission was detailed and I have read it many times, and I do not think it is necessary to describe. What matters is what it communicated about speed, about scale, and about the fact that the early warning sensor network that our people had installed, the one that the Council had never properly integrated into their defense architecture because they had not believed they needed to, was now operating in a degraded state because it had not been maintained in 31 months. The nodes could still detect large-scale movements. They could not reliably distinguish a Void Swarm cluster from background radiation scatter at distances beyond 6 light-years. The confirmation window before a contact became a confirmed threat had extended from 40 minutes to nearly 6 hours. 6 hours was not enough time to evacuate a civilian system. I sat with that information for a long while. I sat with it in the quiet signals room of Callisto 7, while Owen and the rest of my team worked their stations, and I looked at the starfield on the main display, and I thought about Vorath's laugh, and about the small click of Lena's badge on the podium railing, and about the 4,000 humans who had filed quietly onto transports and gone home without a word. Owen brought me a message from Council diplomatic channels. It had been routed through 3 intermediary addresses before it reached the closed frequency for the old human embassy on the main Council station, a frequency no one had listened to in 31 months. Someone at the Council had either not realized we no longer monitored it, or had hoped we still did. It was from Vorath. It was short. It said that recent events had prompted a review of certain Council positions. It said that the Council wished to open a dialogue with human representatives regarding matters of mutual concern. It used the word partnership, which was a word no Council delegate had ever used in reference to humanity, in any session I had attended. I read it twice. I forwarded it to Lena Hargrove's office, which was now on Earth, in the new building that housed the Office of Sovereign Affairs, a department that had not existed when we left Council space, and now employed over 300 people. I included a single line of my own at the bottom of the forward. He found the closed channel. Lena's reply came back in 4 hours. It was 2 words. I know. We did not reply to Vorath, not because we were making a deliberate point of ignoring him, though I would be dishonest if I said the thought did not occur to me, but because, in the weeks that followed, we were simply very busy with other things. 2 more Council frontier posts went dark. A 3rd reported contact and managed to transmit a full data package before their comms were cut. Our signals team spent 72 hours processing that package. What we learned refined our understanding of the swarm's movement patterns considerably, and the projections we generated from that data were shared with our fleet command within hours. The council was still holding emergency sessions and drafting resolutions. We were already moving ships. I want to be precise about something. We had not decided to help the council. We had decided to address a threat to inhabited space. Those are not the same decision, and the difference matters. The systems that the Void Swarm was moving toward were not empty. They held billions of lives, Kethoron, Prethian, Valesi, and dozens of other species whose political relationship with humanity ranged from complicated to cold. We were not moving ships because those lives were allied with us, or friendly to us, or deserving of our help in any specific way we had calculated. We were moving ships because there were people in those systems and the threat was real, and we were the ones who were prepared. This is, I think, the thing that was most difficult for the Council to understand, and perhaps the most important thing about what humanity did in those years. We did not leave because we were angry. We did not return because we forgave. We operated according to our own judgment about what mattered, and we did not require anyone's permission to act on it. A second message arrived from the Council. This one was not routed through the closed embassy channel. It was sent directly to the Office of Sovereign Affairs on Earth, through a new frequency, which meant someone on the Council side had done the work of finding our current contact address. It was signed not by Vorath but by the Council's full presiding body, and it used language that I had genuinely never seen in any Council document before. It said, "We were wrong. We need your help." Lena was in a meeting when it arrived. Her aide printed it and slipped it to her. I know this because I was in the same meeting, connected by secure link from Callisto 7. I watched her read it. I watched her fold it once and set it on the table in front of her. She asked for a cup of tea. The meeting continued. We did not reply for 11 days, 32 months. That was the number I kept coming back to in those weeks. 32 months from the day Lena set her badge on that podium railing, to the day I walked through the entrance of the Sovereign Fleet Command building on Earth, and showed my new identification to the officer at the desk. 32 months, and what I found inside that building bore almost no resemblance to the organization I had belonged to when we were still attending council sessions and drafting diplomatic proposals that got laughed at, and trying to be patient and diplomatic and careful. The Fleet Command building was not grand. It had been built quickly and practically, and it looked like it. The corridors were clean and wide and well lit. The offices were functional. People moved through them with the particular energy of a place where the work was genuinely urgent and everyone understood why. There was no ceremony about it. No one was performing importance. They were simply doing things that needed to be done. My new posting was as a senior intelligence coordinator, which meant I sat in rooms where decisions were being made, and made sure the people making them had the most accurate picture of external conditions that we could construct. On my first morning, I attended a briefing that covered 7 distinct operational matters. I had attended council briefings that covered one matter in 4 hours. This briefing covered 7 in 90 minutes, and left time for questions. The scale of what had been built was something I had followed from a distance at Callisto 7, but seeing it directly was different. When we left council space, humanity had a respectable but not exceptional fleet. We had good ships, reliable, well-maintained, capable in the roles they were designed for. We had not prioritized military development during the council years because we had been led, by the logic of collective security and shared frameworks, to believe that the point of belonging to the council was that no single species needed to maintain independent military capability beyond a certain level. The council's joint defense framework would handle existential threats. Member species contributed to it proportionally and trusted the system. We had trusted the system. The system had laughed at us. In 32 months, the calculus had changed entirely. There were 3 shipyards now operating at continuous capacity. One in the outer belt, one at a Lagrange point off our second moon, and one at a deep space installation that had been constructed specifically to be outside any conventional detection range. The ships coming out of those yards were not incremental improvements on what we had before. They were the product of 32 months of engineers and designers who had been told for the first time in their professional lives that there were no political constraints on what they could build, and no requirement to harmonize their specifications with anyone else's standards. They had taken that freedom and used it with a thoroughness that still surprised me when I reviewed the technical reports. The new drive systems alone were remarkable. We had been working on 3 parallel approaches to faster-than-light propulsion for years, each running at reduced funding, because the Council's framework for shared research required that member species not develop technologies that could create asymmetric capability advantages without council approval, which in practice meant that any technology that might make us significantly more capable than other species got delayed, diluted, or shared before we could fully develop it ourselves. Without that constraint, all three programs had moved forward simultaneously. One of them had produced results that our physicists were still arguing about in the best possible way, arguing about implications and applications rather than arguing about whether it worked. Nathan Gale, the fleet's chief engineer, took me through the second shipyard during my first week. He was a compact, direct man, with very short gray hair, and the habit of pointing at things when he explained them, rather than describing them in the abstract. He pointed at the vessel currently in final assembly in Bay 7 and said, "That is the fastest thing any species in this part of the galaxy has built. It is also the most heavily armored, and it carries enough independent power generation capacity to operate for 4 years without resupply." I looked at the ship. It was large. It was not the largest ship I had ever seen, but it had a quality to it that the largest ships I had seen in council space did not. A density, a solidity, as though every part of it was doing something necessary, and nothing had been included for appearance. "How many like it?" I asked. 14 complete, Nathan said. 11 in build. 6 more keels laid last month. I did not say anything for a moment. "The Council's best comparable vessel," I said. "How does it compare?" Nathan's expression did not change, but there was something in the pause before he answered. "It doesn't really," he said. "It's a different category of thing." That was not arrogance. It was a simple statement of what 32 months of unconstrained work had produced, when applied by people who had spent years being held back, and had a great deal of backed-up capability to express. It was not only the ships. The medical division had done things that I found difficult to summarize without sounding as though I were exaggerating. There had been a condition, a degenerative neural disease that affected roughly 1 in 8,000 humans, and had no effective treatment. The Council's pharmaceutical framework had classified research into it as low priority relative to cross-species common conditions, which meant it was never funded at the level it needed to be. In 32 months, without that constraint, a team in Oslo had developed a treatment that worked in clinical trials at a rate that their lead researcher called embarrassingly good, and then immediately corrected herself and said she was not embarrassed at all, actually. And the rate stood. There were similar stories in materials science, in energy storage, in agricultural technology, in communications infrastructure. 32 months of working on our own terms, for our own reasons, without having to navigate the Council's framework of harmonized development and collective approval. The Prethian Institute, one of the galaxy's oldest and most respected scientific bodies, had published a paper describing humanity's development trajectory during this period as alarming in its effectiveness. They meant it as a warning to their own member species. We had read it as something else. Secretary General Adaize Okafor had been in office for 14 months when I arrived at Fleet Command. She had been elected on a single platform, sovereign development. Not isolation, not aggression, sovereignty. The right to build what we could build, develop what we could develop, and deploy our capabilities according to our own judgment about what the situation required. She was a tall woman, with a quiet manner, and a way of asking questions in meetings that made it very clear she had already thought through the answer, and was checking whether you had too. I was in the room when the Council's message arrived, not the one from Vorath that had come weeks earlier. This was the formal message from the full presiding body, signed by representatives of 23 species, using language that no Council document had ever used in reference to humanity. It was a request, a direct, unambiguous request for help. Okafor read it at her desk with 2 of her senior staff and me present. She read it once. She folded it. It had been printed on paper, I do not know why. Perhaps someone had thought paper was more formal, and she set it on her desk. She asked for tea. We sat with it for 11 days because we were not stalling, and we were not making a point. We were genuinely occupied with other things. The Void Swarm's movement data from Callisto 7 was being processed and incorporated into fleet positioning plans. 3 ships were being redeployed to the Outer Rim, on a schedule that had been set before the Council's message arrived, and did not need to change because of it. A supply coordination problem with the 3rd shipyard was consuming significant attention from Nathan's team. A medical logistics question about the distribution of the new neural treatment needed a decision from the health office. The Council's message sat on Okafor's desk and waited. because we were busy, and because we had learned, through years of sitting in council chambers and watching our proposals wait, while others decided whether they were worth addressing, that urgency was something you could impose on others by controlling what they needed. They needed us now. We knew what that felt like, and we did not rush. On the 11th day, Okafor convened a full senior staff meeting. I sat at the far end of the table with Owen, who had been transferred to Fleet Command 2 months before me, and had already made himself indispensable in the way he always did. Quietly, thoroughly, without drawing attention to it. Okafor put the folded message in the center of the table. "We're going to respond," she said. "We are not going to respond by rejoining the council. We are going to respond by proposing something new." She opened a folder and placed a document on the table. It was not long. I read it in 4 minutes. It was the first draft of what would later be called the Compact of Sovereign Peers, and reading it for the first time at that table was one of the clearest moments I have ever experienced. The sensation of something complicated becoming suddenly, permanently simple. "This is what we bring to the meeting," Okafor said. "We're not asking to come back. We're offering to start over, on different terms." No one in that room disagreed. The council's reply to our acceptance of their request came within hours. They were eager, which was understandable. 2 more frontier posts had gone dark in the time we had taken to respond. The meeting location was the only point of real discussion. The council proposed their main station. Okafor proposed our flagship. There was a brief exchange of messages that lasted about 40 minutes, and then the council agreed to our location. I noted that too. I noted everything. But this one I noted carefully, because a year earlier, the suggestion that human representatives were not the ones who would travel to meet, but the ones others would travel to reach, would have been treated as a provocation. Now it was just logistics. Owen brought me a coffee as I was drafting the coordination plan for the meeting. "Do you think they've really changed?" he asked. It was more words at once than Owen typically used, which meant he was genuinely asking. I thought about it. "I think they've gotten scared," I said. "Whether that's the same thing depends on what they do next." He nodded and went back to his desk. The flagship departed 3 days later. I was aboard. 32 months after walking out of that chamber, I was going back to the space we had left, not as a returning member of an organization that had tolerated us, but as a representative of something that had been built in the time they had spent regretting our absence. The stars outside the viewport looked the same. Everything else was different. The Kethoran delegation arrived at the docking port of the human flagship Steadfast at 0900 hours, and the first thing they did when they stepped aboard was stop walking. I was standing at the edge of the reception corridor with the rest of our team, close enough to watch their faces. There were 6 of them, Vorath, 2 aides, and 3 representatives from other council species who had requested to attend. They had been in council ships and council stations their entire careers. They had never been inside a human vessel of this class, because this class had not existed the last time they had seen us. Vorath was a composed being. He had been a diplomat for decades, and diplomats learn early to control what their faces show. But there was a moment, very brief, perhaps 2 seconds, when he looked down the main corridor of the Steadfast, and his composure did something it was not supposed to do. It wavered. The corridor was not designed to impress. That was the thing. It was designed to function. The ceiling was high because large equipment needed to be moved through it. The lighting was full spectrum because people needed to work under it for months without biological disruption. The construction materials were chosen for durability, thermal stability, and ease of repair. Every choice had a reason. But the sum of all those functional choices was something that looked, and felt, like capability taken entirely seriously, and that was not what Vorath had expected. He recovered quickly. He was good at his job. We walked them to the conference room. It was a plain room with a long table, chairs designed for several body types, and a display wall that was currently blank. No decorations, no symbolic items, no attempt to communicate anything through the room's arrangement, except that this was a place where work happened. Secretary General Okafor was already seated when we arrived. She had a folder in front of her and a glass of water. She stood when they entered, greeted them by name with correct pronunciation, and gestured to the chairs on the opposite side of the table. Clean, correct, entirely professional, with that quality she had of seeming to have anticipated the moment she was in. Vorath took the central chair across from her. His aides arranged themselves to his sides. The other 3 delegates sat at the ends. "Thank you for making the journey," Okafor said. We appreciate your willingness to meet, Vorath replied. His common tongue was excellent. It had always been excellent. There was a brief silence of the kind that happens when both sides are deciding who is going to say the harder things first. Okafor let it sit. She was, I had learned, extraordinarily comfortable with silence. She had grown up in Lagos, she had once mentioned in passing, where silence in a negotiation was considered a form of pressure, and she had learned to use it as such. Vorath said, "The Council recognizes that events have moved in a direction that requires a reassessment of prior positions." I wrote down prior positions in my notes. It was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Which prior positions specifically? Okafor asked. Another silence. Shorter this time. The characterization of human contributions to galactic governance, Vorath said, and the assessment of certain security recommendations that were not given adequate consideration. Okafor nodded slowly. The Void Swarm warnings. Among other matters. The request for a shared sensor network along the rim. Yes. The proposal to establish joint rapid response protocols for frontier incidents. Vorath's expression tightened very slightly. Yes. The materials supply framework that our delegation proposed in the third session of the previous governance cycle, which was tabled without review. There was a longer pause. Yes, Vorath said. Okafor picked up the folder in front of her and placed a document on the table. She did not slide it across. She placed it in front of her own position and let it sit there. Then let's start there, she said. The document was the compact. Not a draft anymore, the final version, which our legal team in Okafor's office had refined over the preceding 11 days while we were supposed to be simply deciding whether to respond. We had been responding the entire time. We had just been doing it in our own offices rather than in a reply message. Vorath leaned forward and read. His aides leaned in as well. I watched their eyes move across the text. I watched the Prethian representative, a small being named Serath who I knew from council records was one of the more analytically sharp members of their delegation, read it twice, and then look up at Okafor with an expression that was difficult to categorize. This dissolves the council, Vorath said. This dissolves the current council structure, Okafor said. Yes, and replaces it with a flat Congress. A Congress of sovereign peers, equal speaking rights, no permanent veto, no hierarchical tier system, decisions by majority with minority protections written into the charter. Vorath set the document down. This is a significant restructuring of galactic governance. It is, Okafor agreed. The Council has operated under its current framework for over 4 centuries. It has. Vorath looked at her steadily. You understand that what you are proposing would fundamentally alter the position of every senior council member species. I do, she said. I also understand that the framework you are describing allowed those senior member species to ignore warnings about the Void Swarm for 7 years, dismiss proposals that would have given you functioning early warning infrastructure, and lose multiple frontier posts, because the sensor network that could have given you adequate response time was degraded, and no one in council space had the maintenance protocols to restore it. The room was very quiet. We are not asking to rejoin the council, Okafor continued, her voice still level, still entirely without heat. We are proposing something that would make the council unnecessary, because what replaces it would be better. We are proposing this because the current situation requires species to work together, and we are willing to do that, but only within a structure that treats every species as what they are, which is sovereign, capable, and deserving of equal voice. Vorath looked at the document again. Then he looked at the display wall, which was still blank. Then he looked at Okafor. If we do not agree to this framework, he said carefully, what is the alternative? Okafor reached into her folder and placed a second document on the table. She did slide this one across. It crossed the table smoothly and stopped in front of Vorath. He looked down at it. It was a deployment summary. 7 human fleet vessels currently positioned at the leading edge of the Void Swarm's projected path. Another 4 en route. Full engagement readiness across all units. Timestamps showing that these deployments had begun 9 days ago. Before the Council's message had been answered, before this meeting had been arranged. The alternative, Okafor said, is that we continue doing what we have already been doing, which is addressing the threat according to our own judgment, on our own timeline, with our own resources. The inhabited systems in the swarm's path will be defended regardless of what framework we operate under. We are not making our assistance conditional on your agreement to the compact. We are simply telling you that the compact is what we are offering, and that it is not negotiable in its core structure." She paused. "You are welcome to have your legal teams review the charter language. We are happy to discuss implementation timelines and transition procedures, but the principle of equal standing is not a point of negotiation. It is the foundation. Without it, there is no meeting." Vorath sat with this for a long time, long enough that one of his aides shifted slightly in their seat, long enough that the Prethian delegate, Sarath, quietly picked up the compact document and began reading it a third time. Then Vorath said something I had not expected. He said, "We owe you an apology." The room was still. Okafor did not respond immediately. She let the words exist in the air for a moment. "The Council's characterization of your species," Vorath continued, "and specifically my remarks in the session 3 years ago, they were wrong. They were not simply imprecise or politically motivated. They were wrong. I had the data from your proposals. I understood the data. I chose to dismiss it, because accepting it would have required the Council to acknowledge that a species we had categorized as junior had correctly identified a threat that we had failed to recognize. That was a failure of judgment on my part, and I am telling you this directly because I believe it should be said directly. I was writing this down. I was writing every word." Okafor was quiet for another moment. Then she said, "I appreciate you saying that." She did not say, "We accept your apology." She did not say, "All is forgiven." She did not say, "We understand." She said 4 words that acknowledged the statement without resolving it, because some things are not resolved by acknowledgement, and she understood that, and she trusted Vorath to understand it too. Then she moved on. "Shall we discuss the implementation timeline?" The Prethian delegate Sarath set down the compact document and said quietly, "I am prepared to sign this now." Vorath looked at him, then at the Valesi representative, who nodded, then at the collective delegate, who made the gesture their species used for affirmation. 3 species signed within the hour, 2 more before the evening session ended. Vorath signed last. He picked up the stylus, held it for a moment, and signed his name at the bottom of the document in a slow, careful hand. I kept my face entirely neutral. It required effort. Owen, standing 2 seats down from me, caught my eye for exactly 1 second, and then looked back at his notes. "That was enough. I want to tell you about the Battle of Erithus Reach, because I was there for the edge of it, and because of what it meant beyond what it was. What it was, factually, was the largest coordinated action against the Void Swarm that any species had mounted in recorded history. 7 human vessels, 4 Prethian ships, 2 Valesi cruisers, and a Kethoran escort craft met the swarm's leading cluster at a point 12 light-years from the nearest inhabited system. The engagement lasted 19 hours. It was difficult, and it was costly, and 3 of our ships took damage that required months of repair afterward. No lives were lost on the human side, which I attribute to the quality of the vessels and the preparation of the crews, both of which were products of those 32 months of unconstrained development. The Prethian and Valesi ships lost personnel, and that matters and should not be minimized. The swarm cluster was stopped, not destroyed. The Void Swarm is not something you destroy at a single engagement, but it was stopped, pushed back, disrupted. The inhabited systems it had been moving toward were given time. Time is what early warning and rapid response buy you, and we had both. I was not in the battle itself. I was on the Steadfast, which was positioned at the command coordination point 30 light minutes back, processing data and maintaining communication with all units. I sat at my station for 19 hours and watched the battle through sensor feeds and transmission data, and I can tell you that what the crews of those ships did was extraordinary, and that it was possible because of preparation, and that the preparation was possible because we had spent 32 months building without constraint. After the battle, when the engagement was over, and the ships were reforming, and the damage assessments were coming in, I stepped away from my station and stood in the corridor outside the signals room for a few minutes, just to be still, just to let the 19 hours settle. Nathan Gale was in the corridor too, reading a technical report on his tablet. He looked up when I came out. "All ships accounted for," he said. "I know," I said. "I was watching." He nodded and went back to his report. That was Nathan. The work was the thing. I stood there for a while longer. The Compact Congress opened 6 weeks later. The station chosen for it was not the old council station. That building still existed, but no one had proposed it, and no one had needed to explain why it wasn't proposed. The new station was under construction, and the first session was held in temporary facilities while the permanent structure was completed, which meant the inaugural session of what would replace 4 centuries of galactic governance happened in a series of connected modular rooms with flat-pack furniture and climate systems that were slightly too warm. I thought it was perfect. I had been assigned to the human delegation's support staff for the opening session. I arrived the morning before the first formal meeting and walked the corridors of the new station, which were clean and plain and already felt different from the old council chambers, not because of any deliberate design choice, but simply because the people moving through them were carrying themselves differently. There was no central tier, no elevated platform from which certain species addressed the rest. The Congress floor was flat. Every delegation's position was at the same level. The acoustic system was designed to amplify every voice equally, which had required a custom configuration because different species had very different vocal ranges, and the engineering team had solved it with a distributed speaker system that adjusted dynamically to each speaker. I noticed the acoustic panels in the ceiling on my walkthrough. I stood under them for a moment and said a few words quietly, just to hear how it sounded. Even, balanced. The sound went out from me and came back clean. Lena Hargrove was at the opening session. She was not the ambassador anymore. She had taken a different role, something quieter, in the Office of Sovereign Affairs. But she was there as an observer, which she had requested and been granted. I found her at the back of the observation gallery, standing with her arms crossed, watching the Congress floor fill up. She looked the same as she had the day she walked out of the council chamber. The same stillness, the same quality of having already arrived at whatever conclusion the situation was going to eventually reach. "Does it feel different?" I asked her. She thought about it. Lena never answered quickly. "The room is flat," she said. "That's different." She was not being literal, or not only being literal. The room being flat was the thing behind the thing. The first session opened without ceremony, because Okafor had specifically asked that the opening be a working session rather than a ceremonial one. She felt, and I agreed with her, that the best way to establish what this body was going to be was to begin by doing what it was supposed to do. So the first item on the Congress agenda was a practical one, coordinating the response framework for ongoing void swarm activity in the outer rim. Every species at the table had something to contribute. The conversation was direct and specific, and it produced, within 4 hours, a set of agreements that would have taken the old council months. I sat in the gallery and watched and wrote notes and felt something I do not have a perfect word for. Not pride. Pride feels like it points at yourself. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction feels complete. And this was not complete. It was more like recognition, like looking at something and realizing it matches a picture you had been carrying for a long time, without quite knowing you were carrying it. After the first session, there was a reception in an adjoining room. I stood near one of the serving tables with a glass of something that was not quite wine, and watched the delegates from different species talk to each other, without the weight of the council's tier system telling them who should be addressing whom. Vorath found me there. He was without his aides. He had a glass of something in his own hand and he looked, if I am being honest, slightly tired in a way that I had never seen him look in any council session, as though something he had been carrying for a long time had been set down, and the muscles that had been holding it were still adjusting. "You were in the delegation 3 years ago," he said, "at the session." "I was. I remember you." "I remember you," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Humanity was always remarkable. I think we simply did not want to see it, because seeing it required us to reconsider what we had decided about your species, and we had invested a great deal in that decision." I listened to this. I let it sit. "I want to tell you something," I said. "Not on behalf of the delegation or the Secretary General, just as a person who was in that room." He waited. "We did not leave because of your remark," I said. "Your remark was the last remark in a very long series. We left because we had concluded that being in that chamber was costing us more than it was giving us. The remark was just the moment when the math became clear." He nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now the math is different," I said. "The chamber is different. The framework is different. We are here because the terms are ones we can build something with." He looked at his glass. "That is a more pragmatic answer than I expected." "We are a pragmatic species," I said. "We always have been. The council read that as coldness. It was never coldness. It was just how we think. There was another pause. Not an uncomfortable one. The compact, he said. The equal standing provision. In the old council, a species at our level of galactic tenure would never have agreed to it. I know, I said. We agreed because we had no other reasonable option. I know that too, I said. I am not interested in pretending otherwise. You signed because the situation required it. We proposed it because we believed it was correct. Both things are true. What matters is what happens after the signing, not the reason for it. He looked at me for a long moment. Then something in his expression shifted. Not dramatically. Vorath was not dramatic, but it shifted. You were 29 in that session, he said. I noted it in my report afterward, the youngest human aide in the delegation. I had not known he had noted that. I am 33 now, I said. He made a sound that was, I think, as close as a Kethoran came to a quiet laugh. 4 years older, and here. 4 years older and here, I agreed. He inclined his head in the Kethoran gesture of acknowledgement that was not quite a bow and not quite a nod, but sat somewhere between them, and he moved away through the reception, and I stood with my glass and the hum of conversation around me and the flat floor of the new station under my feet. I thought about Lena's badge on the podium railing, the small, clean click of it, the way she had walked out without looking back, and how I had followed, and how we had stood on the observation terrace and watched the stars. I thought about Owen's 2-second look across the table when Vorath signed. I thought about Nathan pointing at the ship in Bay 7, the fastest thing any species in this part of the galaxy had built, and saying simply that it was what 32 months of honest work produced. I finished my drink. I set the glass down. There was a morning briefing in 6 hours, void swarm response coordination, supply chain logistics for the Outer Rim defense line, a discussion of 3 new applications for observer status to the compact from species that had not been council members. The work had not stopped because the framework had changed. It had accelerated, because the new framework did not slow things down with hierarchy and procedure, and the need to run every decision through species that had decided long ago that their comfort was more important than what was true. I walked back toward the corridor. My new delegate badge was in my jacket pocket, not the old one, not the human delegation credentials I had carried during the council years. The new one, issued by the Compact Congress office, with the new seal, and my name and my role. I had not put it on a lanyard yet. I had been carrying it loose in my pocket, which I recognized as a small thing that meant something larger to me than I had fully worked out. I took it out and looked at it. My name on it. The seal of the Compact, which was designed to represent all member species equally, and had been created by a committee that had argued about it for 2 weeks, and arrived at something clean and simple, which was the right outcome even if the process was exhausting. I put it on. No goodbye had been needed when we left. None was needed now. We had not returned to the place we had departed from. We had arrived somewhere new, something built in the space that leaving had made possible. I went back to work.